Today we're going to learn how to simplify radicals. However, in order to learn how to simplify a radical, we need to know what a perfect square is. And a perfect square is just a number made by squaring a whole number. What I mean by that is, or in other words, is the square root, a perfect square, the square root of a perfect square has to be a whole number. So for example, if I take the square root of 6, I'm going to get a decimal like 2.4. So 6 is not a perfect square. But if I take the square root of 16, I get 4. So 16 is a perfect square. Or if I take the square root of 25, I get 5. So 25 is also a perfect square because I get a whole number when I take the square root of it. So on this table that we have here, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to list the first 10 perfect squares, and your job before you go on to your task is you're going to list the rest of them because you will need them in order to complete your task. So the first perfect square would be 1 times 1, or 1 square, which gives me 1. The second one would be 2 square, which gives me 4. So the second perfect square is 4. The third one would be 3 times 3, which is 9. Then I do 4 times 4, which is 16. I do 5 times 5, which is 25, and I continue that same pattern. 6 times 6 is 36. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9 is 81, and 10 times 10 is 100. So these are all perfect squares, because if I square root any of these numbers that I've listed here, I would get a whole number back. So your job is to finish out the rest of what goes on here. So what's the 11th perfect square, the 12th, the 13th, all the way to the 20th perfect square. So now we're going to use what a perfect square is to simplify something like the square root of 80. The way we do this is you want to find the biggest perfect square, emphasis on the biggest, that fits into this number. Now there might be multiple perfect squares that I can divide 80 by without getting a decimal, but I want to figure out what's the biggest one. So for example, I know that 4 goes into 80 because 4 divided by 80 gives me 20. But I want to figure out what's the biggest one first. So I'm going to start with the biggest number and work my way downwards till I find the biggest perfect square that I can divide 80 by. So I know it can't be 81 because 81 is too big. If I do 80 divided by 64, that's going to give me a decimal, so it can't be 64. If I do 80 divided by 49, it's also not going to fit in. It's not going to give me a whole number when I divide it. If I do 80 divided by 36, it's also going to give me a decimal. 25 is also not, 80 is also not divisible by 25. But I know that 80 divided by 16 is actually going to give me a whole number. So the biggest perfect square that goes into 80 is actually 16, because 16 times 5 gives me 80. So what I'm going to do is, since I know that 16 times 5 gives me 80, I'm going to break up this radical 80 into two things. I'm going to break it up into 16 multiplied by 5. Because I know 80 is equal to 16 times 5, so I can break it up into those two things. So now that I've broke what's under the radical into one perfect square and another number, okay, I can break it up into two radicals. I can break this up into radical 16 times radical 5. Now, we already know that 16 is a perfect square, so we're going to be able to simplify this over here. And that's actually the square root of 16. Even if you do it in your calculator, you're going to see that it's actually 4, because that's the fourth perfect square. So I can turn radical 16 into 4, and I'm left with the square root of 5. So radical 80 simplified is just simply 4 square root 5. And I know that I can't go any further than this, because if I try to break up 5, there's no perfect square that goes into 5. If I try 4, 5 divided by 4 is going to give me a decimal, and 1 is just going to give me the exact same thing, so I know that I'm done. I know that I've simplified this enough until whatever's in here, whatever's inside of my radical, cannot be simplified any further. So another way that you can see a problem like this is that they can give you something like what we have here in example 2. 2 radical 18, where they're asking you again to simplify this out. And it's going to be the exact same process that we just went through. I want to figure out first what is the biggest perfect square that goes into. First, I want to figure out what's the biggest perfect square that goes into 18. I'm going to forget about this 2 that's on the outside for a minute, and I'm going to simplify what's under the radical first. So, I'm going to start at 16 because that's the number closest to 18. But 18 divided by 16, that's going to give me a decimal, so I can't use that one. And then I'm going to try 9, and I know that 18 divided by 9 gives me 2. So I can break up this 18 into 9 times 2. Okay, all I've done is I've ignored the 2 that's outside of the radical for a minute, and I've broken up 18 into 2 numbers where one of them has to be a perfect square, the biggest one. So now I'm going to do the same thing that I did in example 1, and I'm going to break this 9 times 2 into 2 separate radicals. So I have 2, the square root of 9, 2 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. And again, I know that this radical 9 came from a perfect square. So that means that I can do 2 times the square root of 9 should give me a whole number, because that's a perfect square. So that's 2 times 3. And then that radical 2 remains just like that, because there's no perfect square that I can divide 2 by. Okay, so now I can just simplify this even further. I know this is multiplication that's happening here, so I can say, okay, well, already know that 2 times 3 is 6. So here my final answer is actually just 6 radical 2. And I've simplified 2 radical 18 and I've simplified it to 6 radical 2. And if I put 2 radical 18 into the calculator, and I do 6 radical 2 into the calculator, you should see that it'll both give me the exact same values. These are just 2 different versions of writing the same number. So remember your 3 steps. First, I need you to list out the rest of the perfect squares. Once you've listed out all the perfect squares, go ahead and find the biggest one that you can divide whatever's under your radical in, and then break it up into 2 separate ones, and find and simplify your square roots.